Chapter 5 of Operation Terror by Murray Leinster. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Operation Terror, Chapter 5. When darkness fell, Lockley and Jill were many miles away from the clearing where he had made the SOS. They were under a dense screen of leaves from a monster tree whose roots rose above ground at the foot of its enormous trunk. They formed a shelter of sorts against observation from a distance. Lockley had spotted a fallen tree far gone with wood rot. He broke pieces of the punky stuff with his fingers. Then he realized that without a pot the bracken shoots he'd gathered could not be cooked. They had to be boiled or not cooked at all. "We'll call it a salad," he told Jill, "minus vinegar and oil and garlic, and eat what we can." She'd been pale with exhaustion before the sun sank, but he hadn't dared let her rest more than was absolutely necessary. Once he'd offered to carry her for a while, but she'd refused. Now she sat drearily in the shelter of the roots, resting. "We might try for news," he suggested. She made an exhausted gesture of assent. He turned on the tiny radio and tuned it in. There was no scarcity of news now. A few days past, news went on the air on schedule, mostly limited to 5-minute periods in which to cover all the noteworthy events of the world. Part of that 5 minutes, too, was taken up by advertising matter from a sponsor. Now music was rare. There were occasional melodies, but most were interrupted for new interpretations of the threat to Earth at Boulder Lake. Every sort of prominent person was invited to air his views about the thing from the sky and the creatures it brought. Most had no views, but only an urge to talk to a large audience. Something, though, had to be put on the air between commercials. The actual news was specific. Small towns around the fringe of the park area were being evacuated of all their inhabitants. Foreign scientists had been flown to the United States and were at the temporary area command post not far from Boulder Lake. Rocket missiles were aimed and ready to blast the lake and the mountains around it should the need arise. A drone plane had been flown to the lake with a television camera transmitting back everything its lens saw. It arrived at the lake and its camera relayed back exactly nothing that had not been photographed and recorded before. But suddenly there was a crash of static and the drone went out of control and crashed. Its camera faithfully transmitted the landscape spinning around until its destruction. Military transmitters were beaming signals on every conceivable frequency to what was now universally called the alien spaceship. They had received no replies. The foreign scientists had agreed that the terror beam, paralysis beam, death beam was electronic in nature. Lockley had thought Jill asleep from pure weariness, but her voice came out of the darkness beside the big tree trunk. "You found that out," she said, "about its being electronic." "I had a sample stationary beam to check on," said Lockley. "They haven't, which may be a bad thing. Nobody's going to make useful observations of something that makes him blind and deaf and paralyzed while he's in the act." "There are some things that puzzle me about that. Why haven't they killed anybody yet? They've got the public about as scared as it can get without some killing. And why didn't we get the full force of the beam after the plane had been driven away? They could have given us the full treatment if they'd wanted to. Why didn't they?" "If people run away from the towns," said Jill's voice, very tired and sleepy, "maybe they think that's enough. They can take the towns." Lockley did not answer, and Jill said no more. Her breathing became deep and regular. She was so weary that even hunger could not keep her awake. Lockley tried to think. There was the matter of food. Bracken shoots were common enough, but unsubstantial. It would need more careful observation to note all the likely spots for mushrooms. Perhaps they were far enough from the lake to take more time hunting food. They were almost exactly in the situation of Australian bushmen who live exclusively by foraging, with some not too efficient hunting. But Australian savages were not as finicky as Jill and himself. They ate grubs and insects. For this sort of situation, prejudices were a handicap. He considered the idea with sardonic appreciation. 2 days of inadequate food, and such ideas came. But he and Jill wouldn't be the only ones to think such things if matters continued as they were going. The towns around Boulder Lake were being evacuated. The cordon about it had been made to retreat. There was panic not only in America, but everywhere. In Europe, there were wild rumors of other landings of other ships of space. The stock markets would undoubtedly close tomorrow if they hadn't closed today. There'd be the beginning of a mass exodus from the larger cities, starting quietly but building up to frenzy as those who tried to leave jammed all the routes by which they could get away. If the creatures of the spaceship wanted more than the flight of all humans from about their landing place, there would be genuine trouble. Let them move aggressively, and there would be panic and disorder and pure catastrophe, with self-exiled city dwellers desperate from hunger because they were away from market centers. It looked as if a dozen or two monsters could wreck a civilization without the need to kill one single human being directly. He heard a sound. He turned off the radio, gripping the clumsy club which was probably useless against anything really threatening. The sound continued. There were rustlings of leaves, and then faint rattling, almost clicking noises. Whatever the creature was, it was not large. It seemed to amble tranquilly through the forest and the night, neither alarmed nor considering itself alarming. The clickings again. And suddenly Lockley knew what it was. Of course, he'd heard it in the compost pit shell, when he was a prisoner of the invaders from space. He rose and moved toward the noise. The creature did not run away. It went about its own affairs with the same peaceful indifference as before. Lockley ran into a tree. He stumbled over a fallen branch on the ground. He came to the place where the creature should be. There was silence. He flicked the flint of his pocket lighter, and in the flash of brightness he saw his prey. It had heard his approach. It was a porcupine, prudently curled up into a spiky ball, and placidly defying all carnivores, including men. A porcupine is normally the one wild creature without an enemy. Even men customarily spare it because so often it has saved the lives of lost hunters and half-starved travelers. It accomplishes this by its bland refusal to run away from anybody. Lockley classed himself as a half-starved traveler. He struck with the club after a second spark from his lighter flint. Presently he had a small, barely smoldering fire of rotted wood. He cooked over it, and the smell of cooking roused Jill from her exhausted slumber. "What?" "We're having a late supper," said Lockley gravely. "A midnight snack. Take this stick. There's a loin of porcupine on it. Be careful, it's hot." Jill said, "Oh." Then, "Is there more for you?" "Plenty," he assured her. "I hunted it down with my trusty club, and only got stuck a half-dozen times while I was skinning and cleaning it." She ate avidly, and when she'd finished he offered more, which she refused until he'd had a share. They did not quite finish the whole porcupine, but it was an odd and companionable meal, there in the darkness with the barely glowing coals well hidden from sight. Lockley said, "I'm sort of a news addict. Shall we see what the wild radio waves are saying?" "Of course," said Jill. She added awkwardly, "Maybe it's the sudden food, but I hope you'll remain my friend after this is all over. I don't know anyone else I'd say that to." "Consider," said Lockley, that I've made an eloquent and grateful reply.